Welcome to Smart Franchising with FranSmart. I'm Dan Rowe, and I've masterminded the ascent of local favorites to global dominators. This isn't your usual get-to-know-you chat. We're diving deep. We're revealing the raw truths about franchise wealth building. With over 30 years in the trenches, I'm spilling it all. If you have an appetite for unfiltered tales and the hidden blueprints of franchise prosperity, buckle up. We're diving in. All right, welcome back to Smart Franchising with FranSmart. And right now we're about to talk to Greg Flynn, the largest franchisee in the world, multi-unit, multi-concept, multi-market, I think even multi-country with no signs of slowing down. We're going to get into what Greg thinks it takes for franchisees to succeed and what he looks for in expansion brands, maybe what went well, what didn't go so well, what he wished he could have done over, and any other nugget that we can find to help franchisees and franchisors. Greg's involved with the IFA, recently joined the National Restaurant Association board where we met. So Greg, I appreciate you making time for us.
I'm really happy to be here, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So every company started somewhere, biggest of biggest companies. And obviously you guys are huge. You guys are 2,600 or whatever franchises, but you all started somewhere. Let's hear your story from you.
Well, sure. I mean, if you want to go to the very beginning, I started out by building WorldRaps restaurants in Seattle. WorldRaps was a raw startup. I didn't start it. A friend of mine from Stanford Business School did. I made a small investment in his company. The first one opened in 1995, had lines around the block. We got excited. We were convinced we had the next Starbucks on our hand. So he and I shook hands, and I became a licensee developer of WorldRaps in Puget Sound. And I built 14 of them between 1995 and 99. It was the absolute school of hard knocks. You know, I learned how to lease a space and how to build a restaurant and how to equip it and how to hire people and how to run it and how to market it. And, you know, we were making a go of it, but it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But that's what got me into business.
So WorldRaps, I didn't know that till right now. I thought I did some research and I thought I knew your story, but I didn't know about WorldRaps. I tried to get the rights to WorldRaps when it had one or two stores in San Fran, and I remember that was actually, I invested in Qdoba, and Qdoba even said, he goes, yeah, my original inspiration was WorldRaps. So it's funny, small world. But so after WorldRaps, how did you get going?
So by 99, or a couple of years before 99, you're old enough to recall, for a brief moment, an industry of securitized franchise finance emerged. It was very much like home lending in the thousands, where they would make loans to individual franchisees, and they'd be like 100% non-recourse loans. And then they'd pool them together and call them 70% loans. Somehow they were more valuable together than they were apart. And then they'd sell the securities. And, you know, it was a loan product that was destined to fail, and it did fail. But for a minute there, you could get like a free equity option on a restaurant. Like they were handing out the option to buy a restaurant with no capital. And if it worked out and you could pay them back, great. But if not, you could just hand them the keys. I looked at this and, you know, I was busting my hump building WorldRaps restaurants where you couldn't borrow a penny. And I said, wait a minute, like I can borrow all the money and buy existing restaurants that are already profitable? Like, why wouldn't I do that? So I looked at what qualified for this type of financing, and it was the premier, you know, fast food chains, as you'd expect, McDonald's, Burger King. But in the casual dining space, like, Applebee's qualified. And casual dining was the hot segment of the 90s. It was sort of like fast casual today. It was very fast growing. It was exciting. And there were 8 Applebee's restaurants in the Puget Sound area where I'd been building WorldRaps. And I contacted the owner of them, which was a Cleveland-based franchisee named Don Strang. And I asked him if he wanted to sell. And he said yes. And so we struck a deal, you know, for me to buy them. And I borrowed all the money and bought them.
So you're clearly a finance guy, but you're an operator too, because you're buying something on all that leverage. You're buying something fully leveraged. Like you have to rely on operations to make the whole thing work, right?
So I did learn how to operate restaurants in the 5 years I did it at WorldRaps, and very hands-on. Um, with Applebee's, I was smart enough to know what I didn't know, and I didn't know how to run full service restaurants. I did have a COO I had recruited to help me with WorldRaps, Brad Pettinger. He's still with us today, nearly 30 years later. And he had a background in full service and fine dining. But the key was there was an operator in place, Dan Krebsbach, who had worked in Applebee's in the Midwest for this franchisee, was sent out to Washington in the early 90s to start developing that market for Applebee's. He built the 8 Applebee's there. And while I didn't know anything about Applebee's, he knew everything about running Applebee's. And he was a great guy. We got along from the first second. And, what he shared with Brad and me is that, Applebee's is a very good concept and it could succeed in the Seattle area, but it wasn't being run with sensitivity to sort of local conditions. The main difference between the Midwest and the coast is cost, right? And you have to go for volume. Like you just can't make money in Washington at the same volume you make good money at in Cleveland, right? And he's like, to really break out in volume, like I need to become a different kind of restaurant, like a busy restaurant and a bar. And in the Midwest in the 90s, Applebee's was like a family restaurant.
Yeah.
And Don Strang he's a great guy. We're very close friends. But he was a very typical franchisee who wanted to, he ran a command and control pyramid organization. He was at the top. Everyone else sort of implemented his orders. And he wanted everything run the same, including, the same in Seattle as he did in Ohio and Indiana and everywhere else he had restaurants. And Dan had, those were just a couple ideas, but like a whole bunch of ideas about how he could do it different and for Seattle better. And so when we bought the restaurants, Brad and I said, we hope you're right. We're going to give you the chance to test it out. We're going to give you the resources because we just borrowed all this money, including a line on top of the purchase price. And we want to align our interests through profit sharing and equity. And let's see what you can do. And so Dan implemented all of his ideas right away. And the first year of our ownership was an absolute breakout year. The business kind of turned on a dime. And, had been doing about $45,000 a week and making a little bit of money to by, a couple of years in, we were doing $60,000 a week and making very good money. And then, we had opened up a couple of new restaurants, including one location that Don didn't like, but we gave it a shot and they opened up to very high volumes. And so we then had 10 restaurants. I was like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. This is what I want to do with my career. And so we pivoted. We handed off the WorldRaps business to our CFO. He ran it for another 20 years. And some of them still exist. It's now back in the hands of the original founders. But Brad and I and Dan said, you know what, we're going all in on Applebee's. And I called Don Strang up and said, do you want to sell the rest of your Applebee's? He said, yes. We struck a deal and we bought the 62 Applebee's he had in 3 other markets. So Ohio, Indiana, and New Jersey, Delaware. And that's when we went from being, just a local Seattle franchisee to what became Flynn Group, like this multi-market diversified restaurant business.
Yeah.
We were only one brand, but it was the beginning of being multi-market and national.
So what are some of the things, because you said that the sales on the Northwest stores went up 50%. Like what are some of the things that you did? You did touch on an aligned compensation plan with your team, which I believe in wholeheartedly. Most operators think getting to profitability means cutting. You obviously shared the pie, but what are some of the things that you did so successfully to make those restaurants behave 50% better?
So, Dan was a great proponent of saying you need to staff for the volume you want, right? At 45,000, there was a labor model that, the whole Strang organization had. And it was very hard to even live within that in Washington. But like he was not going to get to the volume that he needed to make money with the labor that was being allowed him. So he said, first of all, it's going to take some investment, but we've got to really staff up to drive volumes in our peak periods. Second, as I mentioned, he made it a bar. And he made it probably the single best chain of bars in the Puget Sound region. And even to this day, we run the highest liquor mix in the country in our Seattle market, with a couple of exceptions like, Jersey City or whatever.
Yeah.
And third, he tailored the menu a little bit. You don't have a lot of flexibility as a franchisee, but, he could add, for instance, like coffee drinks and things like that people in Seattle want that people in Cleveland don't care about. There were just a lot of little changes like that. Physical changes. We bumped out restaurants to drive volume. We added, what are they called, atrium bump outs to just get more seats there, so we could really
More
drive that
seats.
business on a Friday or Saturday night. A lot of little
Yeah.
investments like that.
Yeah, I met Abe Gustin a million years ago, early on in my career, and I remember the culture at Applebee's and the idea of a guy who eventually had as many stores as you. It didn't seem like something that they were that into. How do you convince those guys to let you keep growing in Applebee's? It obviously came because they saw you did a good job.
Well, it's funny, when we went to buy the rest of the Strange restaurants, I went to the then chairman and CEO, Lloyd Hill, and I told him about the deal, and asked his permission, because you need consent. And he paced around and pulled his hair and said, "Oh God, what does this mean? I don't want anyone getting too big." And so he asked for, and I agreed to, a cap on how big we could get within the Applebee's system. And the cap was 11% of the system. And I said, "Lloyd, listen, I hear you. I think I understand your concern. But I think what you'll find, I'm going to agree to this cap. I think what you'll find is that it'll take me a number of years to get there. By the time I get there, you not only won't want to limit our growth, you'll want to encourage our growth, because you'll find that we're a great ally, a collaborator, and a force for good within your system." And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. We finally got to the 11% cap, and he not only, he didn't lift it, they just deleted the cap. We are now 28% of the system. And, we're still growing by, buying and building within that system. And, there's no, there's this very conventional notion that, like, big is bad, or big is threatening, or big is scary, or somehow. That may have been true in some circumstances in the past, maybe even in the present or future. But I think with us, we've now demonstrated it over 6 restaurant brands, that we can be a force for good, and a force for good at scale, that is even more impactful, to benefit the system than anyone else. And that's very deliberate. We, try to be, the best collaborator, the best thought partner, and run our restaurants to the absolute highest standards in all of our brands. We reinvest heavily in our restaurants. We keep them staffed, and we perform very well by the metrics. It's interesting. In the last 2 years, we've had material comp sales outperformance in all 6 of our restaurant brands without a single exception. And I think that's just the cumulative effect of our commitment to running our restaurants well. That's ultimately what franchisors care about, and that's what ultimately gets them over this fear of there being a big partner in the room.
Yeah. You've touched on a few things, but before we move off Applebee's, any other thoughts of like what you guys did operationally? Like when you say we ran our places really well, what are some of those other things people can learn from? And what are some things, like, I know in Applebee's, there are franchisees struggling. Somebody like you takes their stores and completely turns them around. Like, what are those things that you guys do?
Well, let's look at Applebee's. The system average is about 2.7 million. Our average is over 3.2 million, and we're 28% of the system, right?
Yeah.
And that's just the cumulative effect for 20 years of doing a little bit better each and every year. So yeah, it makes a big difference. We're not struggling. We're actually having a good time of it. And I think that anyone can do this, right? It's not a proprietary thing. It's just all execution. And what it comes down to is running your restaurants well each and every day, everywhere. It sounds simple, but it's actually super hard. There are many things that go into that. People first and foremost, and that's an issue of culture and structure and compensation, which attracts the best people and motivates them and retains them the best. Structure plays a big part of it. We have a unique structure in our business. Facilities play an important part. Right? We have probably the highest standard for physical facility, the physical quality of our facilities in the business. We call it zero tolerance, and the idea is it needs to be perfect, as nearly perfect as a high volume restaurant can be. Investing whatever it takes to get it there and then keep it there. And that obviously has an impact on your guests, It probably saves you money over time in maintenance. But the most important benefit of it is on our own people, right? I mean, we need the best people, and the best people have choices. And the best people want to work with other people with high standards. And they want to work for a business where the owners care and invest in their environment. And if you don't do those things, they go somewhere else. If you do those things, you can keep them, and they will deliver great results. It sounds simple again, but like you'd be surprised how many people out there aren't doing it.
Yeah. No, which is the reason I want to talk to you about this, because there's so many people not doing super obvious things. What about this segment in general? What about casual dining in general? You hear about Fridays closing a bunch of stores, Chili's doing these $10 lunch meals. Like they're basically trying to compete. They're cheaper than QSR. So it's like how tough is this segment right now, and how can someone still thrive in 2024 in casual dining?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think the first question you need to ask yourself is, will there be a large and sustained market for sit down dining with liquor? And I believe that in America, there will be a large and sustained market for that. So someone will sell profitably into that. It's a question of who. I think that segment got overpopulated with lots of undistinguished, undifferentiated competitors through the 90s and the early 2000s. There has been a big reduction in the number of full service restaurants. So, through COVID, a lot of restaurants got weaned out, but they were mostly full service. In fact, the number of full service restaurants in the United States is down from 2019 to 2023 by 15.6%. So, it's very tough on the ones that didn't make it, but for those who are survivors, we're picking up market share that way.
You have a
Um,
supply and demand imbalance. Yeah.
yeah. And then, there are very real scale economies in the business. That's why we are committed to being part of only the biggest, baddest brands, because they have high consumer awareness and they've got giant marketing budgets to support that. And they have supply chain advantages and, scale economies in every way. So, someone is going to make money doing it. And Applebee's is as well positioned as any, chain or independent player out there to do it.
Hmm. And then at some point you diversified again. So after Applebee's, what happened?
Yeah, so we did nothing but Applebee's for over 12 years. And, we were determined to get, big, but much more importantly, good at that. It was during that period that we laid the foundation for the whole business, the later business. It was the structure, the culture, the systems, the core team, the experience, the reputation, the access to capital. And I'd always thought about diversifying within the industry, but I didn't want to do it until we were ready. But by 2012, it was time. And we were very systematic about it. We didn't just pick another brand that we liked and got into that. We were like, listen, what does the industry want out of restaurants? And our belief is that it's telling you what it wants. It wants mostly QSR restaurants. And it's even told you which of those it likes the best. Like they're the ones that are the most successful. Right? And, but it wants a large segment of full service and it wants this small but growing segment in between. So we set out to diversify, to recompose ourselves to mirror the industry. And that was a 10-year journey, but we got there. That's exactly what we are now. We're like a 60 to 70% QSR company with like 20 to 30%, full service. And the remainder is fast casual, in our case, Panera. And we have a filter there of premier brands only. And another filter of it needs to be a good place to be a franchisee. So that's how we picked our brands.
Yeah. So Panera, did you originally start building stores, or did you buy a batch of stores initially?
We bought a batch of stores on the West Coast from the franchisor, and
Oh,
they had built a bunch of these cafes, and we're trying to make it, but it's a very difficult environment to operate out here. We already had 60 or so Applebee's on the West Coast, so we knew how to run out here. And so we bought them. They were literally making no money. They're very successful for us now. I mean, they were doing in the low 2 millions, I think, when we bought them. And our average is now 3.5 million out here. That's all the difference between making no money and making good money.
so you nearly doubled the sales of the Paneras. So how'd you do it?
Well, it's a whole bunch of things. It's How do we do it? It's all the secret sauce that goes into running all of our restaurants. From the structure we utilize for organizing our business with local owner operators, with the highest standards for our facilities, being fully staffed, just executing well day to day. I mean, that's the secret, which isn't
Yeah.
all that secret, but like that's the secret.
No, and I like what your partner said, staff for the volume you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. So good. What do you guys own the property or do you lease the property, and why?
So we always buy the properties when we can, but I have no interest in like owning low yielding net leased real estate. So when we buy them, we'll build a restaurant, we'll let it stabilize for a few years, make sure it's like profitable, and then we'll typically sell the real estate and lease it back. And we've done that hundreds of times.
What do you look for in a new brand? Like if you guys were going to do another brand, what are some of the attributes that you look for?
Well, it would be the same attributes we've looked for in our current brands. I mean, premier brands only. By that I mean big, been around for decades, having survived and thrived through multiple economic cycles, having demonstrated legs in all geographies, having broad demographic appeal, having the advantages of scale in every way, especially having huge marketing budgets behind them, and then really being segment leaders, like number one or number two in their segment only. Like it falls off after that. That filters out all startups. It filters out even some very large chains that just don't meet the criteria. But there's still plenty that we can be in. The other filter, as I mentioned, is it needs to be a good place to be a franchisee. Like Chipotle is a great chain, but you can't be a franchisee in it. And
Yeah.
McDonald's is probably the best restaurant brand in the world. But if you want to be a large player like us, it's not the right place to play. So you need to have that filter as well.
Where do you think we are in the cycle? Like 2024 headwinds coming out of COVID, what do you think about the environment, and do you still think it's healthy for people to grow in this environment?
Well, listen, we had a good 23. 21 was, actually, let me rewind. So COVID hit, we had 4 brands at the time, 2 quick service and 2, fast casual or casual. The quick service restaurants had record years. The other ones didn't. But 21 was the record year for all time in all brands. Like, our Applebee's had a stellar year beyond belief in 21. Panera came back, not all the way, but and then the QSRs did great. 22 had a strong top line in all of our brands, but we got hit pretty hard by inflation in the middle of the P&L. So it wasn't our best profit year. 23 has been a very nice bounce back year for all of our brands. When I look at 24, I feel pretty good. I feel like there's good tailwinds in the business right now. There's falling inflation, there's falling interest rates, there's rising consumer confidence. Consumer demand has actually held up pretty well throughout, to everyone's surprise. Commodity costs are coming down markedly. I mean, in like half our brands, we have negative inflation year over year right now. So I think it's going to be like a decent top line year and a good bottom line year.
Yeah, I do too. And then speaking of diversity, the last I read, you're now doing some non-food franchises. How'd that happen?
Well, 23 was a pivotal year for us. I think it was an inflection point. First of all, we rebranded our business from Flynn Restaurant Group to Flynn Group. We did that in conjunction with growing in 2 new directions. Think of our business now as having sort of 3 growth lanes. There's a big middle lane, which is U.S. restaurants. And then there's a growth lane on the right, call it international. And we acquired the master franchise for Pizza Hut in Australia with 270 restaurants. And we also signed up to become the master franchisee for Wendy's in Australia. So we've now got an international expansion lane. We also planted a flag outside the restaurant industry in what I think of as adjacencies, right? They're consumer-facing operating businesses that operate under a franchise model that aren't restaurants. And I think we can take our core competency, which is, operating a consumer-facing retail business, and apply it in different directions. And so our first flag is in Planet Fitness. We acquired a wonderful business called Alder Fitness, with 37 clubs. We're up to 39 now, 40 next month. And it was founded by a guy named Stan DeMartinez, who's one of the original Planet Fitness franchisees and a great guy. And he's now our partner. He rolled a meaningful amount of money into Flynn Group. So he's our partner running that business. And that'll be a great growth channel for us side by side, you know?
Any advantages you see of non-food over food?
It's, if anything, it's less complicated. You know, food production and distribution, you know, just running restaurants is really intense. I mean, anyone who does it knows that. And it involves a lot of employees moving really fast in a tough environment, and customers are super fickle. It's a high volume and very low margin business, so there's no room for mistakes. You know, fitness is a different kind of business. It's a subscription business. It has fewer employees. I mean, there are challenges, and Stan and his team are masters at figuring out how to, you know, make the most out of their clubs and, you know, sign up the most members and give them the best experience and everything else. It's different than running restaurants, though. It's a little less intense. You know?
Can you imagine if the restaurant economic model included membership and membership pre-sales?
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, you just draft it off their bank accounts every month. That'd be perfect.
That's funny. So what I'm hearing is like your formula, your ability to be successful in all these different brands all over the country. I just asked you earlier if you thought 24 is going to be good, and you do. Do you think that you could start Flynn all over again today, like knowing the formula that you know, big opportunities right now?
I think it'd be much easier to start it today than when we did, because there was no model then. You know, I'd like to think that we've sort of paved the way a little bit, and others also have, and, you know, sort of proved that it can be done, but also attracted, you know, interest from the finance community, both debt and equity. And so, yeah, I think it can be done today.
Yeah, I've been at this for 30 years, and I know a lot of big franchisees, but they're big operators, right? They sort of organically grew into pretty decent sized companies. I don't know anyone who's actually used institutional capital the way you have and approached it the way you have. Did you kind of kick that off? Do you feel like you kind of started that trend, or?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. But you think it's easier today than when you started. That's actually really encouraging.
I listen. I mean, yes and no. Like, restaurant margins are basically lower now than they were 25 years ago. Like, that makes it harder. Restaurant finance is more available. That makes it easier. Restaurant costs, like building restaurants, cost more. That makes it harder. There are more sources of capital for construction restaurants, like landlord financing and build-to-suits. So that makes it easier. I mean, things have changed, but like, it's still doable, I think.
Yeah. And I'm sure you got a lot of buddies that ask you about getting into franchising, and people obviously see your success, think about doing the same thing. What advice do you give someone thinking about getting in the franchise game? Because it's not an ATM machine, which so many people think it is.
Yeah, I've seen this so many times. You know, a lot of people come into it and they think what you need to do is just buy a bunch of restaurants and somehow they run themselves, and that's where you make the money, is on the buy. That couldn't be more misguided. Like, the thing that matters the absolute most, it swamps everything else, is execution. It's running your restaurants well each and every day, everywhere. And that's our number one mission at Flynn. Everything else is subordinate to it. Everything is designed to support that and only that. Like, the buying stuff, that's easy, right? And, you know, there have been lots of, I've seen this in all of our systems, where people come in, they buy a bunch of restaurants, they lever it up, and then, oh, wow, you know, the performance isn't as good as I thought, or it's worse than it was, and suddenly they're in trouble and the whole thing falls apart and they lose all their money. Like, that's probably the most common outcome. So, you know, if you're going to get in this business, like, you have to be an operator. Like, don't do it unless you want to, for the rest of your career, think of yourself as and be a restaurant operator, and be surrounded by restaurant operators. Like, that's what matters, right?
Yeah. If I were getting into Applebee's today or Panera today or something like that, I would want to seek out guys like you and learn, right? Success leaves clues. And I would try to like figure out all the the secret sauce within these systems. Is it pretty easy to gravitate towards the successful franchisees, and are they pretty open at sharing secrets of success?
You mean our franchisees open with each other?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, listen, I have, I view my fellow franchisees as my brothers. I mean, we literally are like families, especially where I've been the longest, like Applebee's. I mean, these guys are like family, and I tell them everything, and I think they tell me everything, and there are really no secrets. Part of it is helped by the way that system is organized, where we each have sort of large exclusive territories, so we're not stepping all over each other.
Right.
But like it's super collaborative. But even where that's not the case, and like Taco Bell, for instance, where there's a lot of mixed markets, franchisees have a very high level of sort of mutual assistance toward each other, and affection and understanding and friendships. I mean, I have some of my greatest friendships come from like the people I met in franchising along the way.
Yeah, I agree. I've had the same experience. How about franchisors? Like, it always baffles me. There's no money in single unit franchisees. All the money is in when you get great big franchisees, multi-unit franchisees. Yet so many franchisors frustrate franchisees. Not naming names or anything like that, but are there things like, if you're going to give advice to franchisors, is there anything that you would recommend franchisors do to get and keep people like you growing instead of thinking about getting the heck out of that brand?
I would just say judge people not by what they say, because talk is cheap, but by what they do. And they need to do it over a matter of years for it to be real and consistent. But if you do that, you can tell pretty quickly, like, who are your actual, great franchisees who you want to grow in your system. And that will help you get over, prejudices regarding, like how big a franchisee is, or what they look like, or how they talk, or whatever. Judge them by how they execute in their restaurants. That is the thing that matters.
Yeah. All right. Well, good. You've given us some good nuggets. We're going to go back and slice and dice this. And I really appreciate it. You've been open and given some really good feedback.
Oh, Dan, it's fun. I enjoy it.
Yeah. Any other thoughts of something that you wish you could have done over again? Any bumps or bruises along the way that knowing now what like if you could have done it all over again?
Honestly, if I had to do all over again, I'm not sure there's anything I would have done differently, including the mistakes. And we made plenty along the way, but we learned from them. And it's part of the ingredients that go into, that ultimate successful stew, I think. So no, I have no regrets.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to Smart Franchising with FranSmart. I'm your host, Dan Rowe. If you enjoyed today's episode, this podcast is only going to get better. Please like, comment, and subscribe to hear more from the most successful franchisors and franchisees, and we'll see you next time.